To kick us off today, I am really delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Shara Evans. Shara is a technology futurist, and she's also a keynote speaker, as we'll see today. She's recognized as one of the world's top female futurists, and with fusing her engineering background with intuitive understanding on how society is likely to respond to new technologies. She's also the founder of CEO of Market Clarity, an award-winning technology analyst firm, and a regular media commentator on technology issues. She's been appearing on shows such as Sky News, ABC's Q&A, The Project, Weekend Sunrise, and more. She's currently also appearing on Fox Network's New Life 2.0 series in the US, and was recently named by Forbes as one of the world's top 50 female futurists. Shara helps her clients understand new product and service opportunities, as well as threats that are being underpinned by emerging technologies. Shara is passionate about helping organizations think outside the box of what's available today to imagine the world in 5 to 10 years and commercialize these concepts into innovative new products and services. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Shara.
Thank you so much, Bella, and greetings to everybody in CoreNet in California. I hope everybody is doing well between the combination of COVID and all the wildfires. I think all of you are probably going through some tremendously difficult times. When it comes to wildfires, I'm coming to you live from Sydney, Australia. And boy, we call them bushfires out here, but we've had our share. January, February, it was just a constant haze of smoke and worry about, is my house going to burn down? And it was across the whole country, not just an area. So today, I'm so delighted to be part of this CoreNet presentation. I'm going to be taking you for a bit of a ride into the future of humanity, but I'm going to start out with the here and now and things that are impacting all of you in your daily lives, as well as in the commercial real estate sector. So I'd like to start by sharing some slides, and with any luck, everything will go as planned with doing this. Okay, so as I said, we're going to be talking about the future of humanity and how all this can tie back into the corporate real estate world. So let's talk, first of all, about the new normal. I don't even know if we can say there's going to be a new normal, because what I am seeing is a state of absolutely constant flux. Every time we think that we understand what's happening and we get a hold on things and we start getting out of lockdown, something else happens and boom, we're back to square one. So be ready for more flux, because it's coming at us hard and heavy. One of the things that is absolutely happening all over the world is that remote working has become the de facto normal. In fact, when I think about this whole new normal thing and the impact of COVID, what I would say is that the changes that we are experiencing over the last couple of months are literally equivalent to the changes that we would be seeing in a 5-year period if COVID had not happened. And it's forcing us to very, very rapidly adapt. Now, when it comes to working from home, especially if this is a long-term thing, which I think it will be, because we just don't have a cure in sight. And even though there's lots of frantic work on vaccines and medications and so on, it's going to be a while until we get the entire planet safe and sound and make sure that we don't have any resurgences. So when we think about working from home, one of the things that you'll need to consider is the environment that your staff are working in. They'll need to have appropriate equipment, and you probably will want to think about deploying company-owned computers if you haven't already, rather than having people use their own individual devices, which may be shared by other family members because you would be sending sensitive information across your internet. You probably want to have a VPN deployed if you haven't already. Cybersecurity is a must. And you need to remember that not everybody in your staff is going to be cyber aware or a cybersecurity specialist or an IT specialist and actually know how to configure things. And you'll need to have support for that to make sure that you're keeping your corporate communications secure. But another aspect of this is also how ergonomically sound the environment is that your staff is working in, especially if it's for the long term. You don't want to have your people working from very uncomfortable positions. I actually know one gentleman that's been using an ironing board to use his laptop on because that was the best position that he could get into at the right height. You know, that's not a good long-term solution, especially if this thing lasts for years and years. Another thing is high bandwidth and very, very stable internet connections. And that can be a challenge for a lot of people in their home environment because they're not accustomed to using it for office work for perhaps not only just themselves, but their spouse and other family members. So there's a lot of things that will happen. As we start to go back into the office, what I expect would be best practice is clustering and a staggered return. So by clustering, I'm talking about returning people, let's say in the IT department, maybe a small number of people, making sure that everything is safe. And then once that's established, then you might bring in yet another group of people and so on. So you start to do it gradually. In the long term, though, I think remote working is here to stay. People are getting accustomed to it. You don't have the same sort of social activities that you would have normally, but once again, you've got flexibility. And if you start reducing your space that you're renting, you can actually save, by some estimates, up to $11,000 a year per employee. One of the things that COVID is already impacting is the, I use the term CBD because that's here in Australia, downtown in US speak, but it's really impacting a whole bunch of businesses, small businesses, jobs, real estate. It doesn't matter whether you're a large company or a small company, it's going to impact you. Now, one of the things that you need to recognize from a commercial real estate perspective or a corporate employer is that even if you're not renting the buildings that small businesses use, your staff are accustomed to the amenities provided by all of these small businesses. And when they don't have access to that, then it actually changes the vibe and the work of working in groups of people in a corporate office. I'd like to show you a short video that it's residential based, but I'm going to relate it to how it might fit into the corporate world. This is something that was done by MIT Labs, and it's basically showing convertible space in a house. But what I want you to think about as you're watching this is if you had modular technology that you could use in a corporate space, then you might be able to start to reconfigure things very, very quickly and easily. And if you end up with a lot of people not working in your office, then one of the things you may consider with your corporate real estate holdings is a conversion to part commercial and part residential living. Now, obviously, you wouldn't want to have a shower in the middle of your corporate office, but this is something that you can start to think about. One of the technologies that is rolling out really fast right now, and there are a lot of companies doing it, is robotics, and these are disinfectant bots. These robots, and this is just an example from Thailand, there's two different types, one that uses disinfectant spray and another that uses ultraviolet light. Personally, I prefer the UV light simply because it can get into all the nooks and crannies, the floors, the ceilings, and not leave anything that people might be allergic to or have a reaction to. There are a lot of varieties. They can be completely autonomous or even manually controlled. One of the new innovations is actually a disinfectant door that can do all kinds of things, including fever detection through thermal imaging. I'm going to show you a little short video in the upper right-hand corner.
Food-grade disinfectant solution, and the fog and spray time can be adjusted. It can also monitor the temperature of the personnel with the installation of the body temperature detector and the thermal imaging temperature detector. The whole stainless steel material is resistant to water and deformation, and it has beautiful appearance. Moreover, it is light and movable. The operation of the equipment is intelligent control, and it doesn't need special personnel to operate.
This is a fairly new innovation, and I'm already finding that there are a couple of companies around the world that are starting to introduce this. But if you can imagine, this is something where you have staff walking through the door into your office, and they're literally going through a disinfectant process before they come into the building, and it goes everywhere from the top of their head to the bottom of their toes and everywhere in between. And it can also detect fevers. This could be a really, really important new technology for all kinds of commercial holdings, whether it be an office building or a shopping center or any other building or plant that you may own. Another thing that could be done, and I haven't actually seen it done in reality yet, is that inside of your company where you've got big internal bandwidth, you can start to think about using holograms to help out with keeping your staff entertained and fit. Now, this is something, again, it's futuristic, but it is entirely doable. Hologram technology is available. The thing that's holding it back right now is the lack of bandwidth. But if you're using it inside your building or inside your campus where you've got your own fiber, then it starts to become very viable. And it's increasingly important when we see companies like Gold's Gym file for bankruptcy. So your staff might normally go out at lunch and work out or after work or before work, but if they can't do that now, they need to stay fit and healthy, and this is one way that you can help them to do this. And by the way, if you have real estate in the hotel industry, this is something that you may offer to people inside their hotel room, especially if they're stuck in quarantine for 14 days and can't even go to the hotel gym. One of the new jobs of the future is going to be what I call an office of the future designer. And this is just a cool picture. It's not a real office. It hasn't been invented yet. But notice that everything is socially distanced. Notice that it's using a combination of holograms and augmented reality and all kinds of really, really cool screens. And there will be people who specialize in the design of this new style office. Another brand new job of the future will be people that specialize in virtual real estate sales and virtual real estate development of software. So in the residential market, there are already companies that are designing three-dimensional floor plans and 360 views where people can sit at their home or their office and literally look through every angle inside of somebody's home. The same technology can also be applied into the corporate property space as well. Another aspect of COVID that is being greatly accelerated is the use of smart city technology. And here I'm talking about the whole Internet of Things. I'm talking about smart buildings and smart energy and all kinds of different tracking, and there's good and bad sides to tracking, of course. We want to know where there might be clusters of disease, but we also need to keep in mind privacy. But all of this is being very, very much accelerated by this whole COVID-19 situation and by lockdowns and border restrictions and border closures. Here in Australia, we don't just have border closures internationally, we even have them in between states. And this is the kind of technology that we're going to start using more and more of as we start moving into the future. I'd like to give you an example of a smart city project that I think has good and bad sides to it, and it's in Chicago, so it's a US example. I started tracking this back in 2016, and it's called the Array of Things, and literally they had this idea in mind that in Chicago, they were going to put these sensors that look like beehives on traffic poles. And I've actually seen them in person, and they really do look like little beehives. But in these little devices, they have all kinds of environmental sensors. They're able to track things like barometric pressure and humidity, pedestrian traffic, vehicular traffic, ambient noise, you name it. They're collecting data about things that are happening on a micro neighborhood level. And they're making the data open source so that not only can the city planners use this information to decide on where they should locate things like bus stops, but from your perspective in the corporate real estate market, you could look at things such as where are we getting a lot of pedestrian traffic, where might be a good place to have an office building, or where might be a good place to have transport pickups and so on and so forth. That the data and the applications that you can use with this kind of open source sensor data is truly amazing, and you marry it with artificial intelligence and these big, big, big data sets, and you can start to come to some really interesting conclusions. So that's the good side. Another thing that they're doing in the city of Chicago that I'm not too happy with is that they've been tracking for several years now ride sharing information in a database. No problem with actually tracking that information, but they're making it publicly available, and the data sets that you can look at literally will show the longitude and latitude of the pickup and drop off. And I double checked it again just yesterday, and I literally went from the City of Chicago website, copy pasted it into Google Maps, and I was able to see, on a couple of just different samples that I did, where somebody lived, like a picture of the outside of their house and where they went to. And I'll tell you what, if I put this into a GIS database or an SQL database, I'd be able to figure out patterns of people's movements. And I don't think you need to have that level of information publicly available. I think if it was publicly available, let's say down to, a block area or a neighborhood area, that would suffice to do planning, but you don't actually need to have it so detailed that you can figure out a particular family or person's pattern of movement. Another new technology advance, and this is coming out of the Netherlands, is a smart building that was actually built last year by the Basics Group. And it's powered by a combination of AI and solar panels. So the whole building is powered from solar, and the AI manages the energy consumption and storage and helps with all of the energy management, which is really, really important. Alternative energies are a big deal. There are also some pretty amazing development in the whole area of material sciences. One particular aspect that will impact the corporate real estate market has to do with concrete, because it's the most common material used in buildings. And there are a number of scientific projects around the world where they are working on literally introducing different kinds of bacteria into concrete so that once you start to see a tiny crack, you can pour in a little more of this concrete that has living bacteria in it, and it can seal it up. And why that's important, especially in buildings, is that underneath the concrete in buildings, you've got steel that would get corroded if it actually comes in contact with water. And as I said, there are quite a few developments from around the world. One came from Curtin University here in Australia. There's another that I was looking at just recently from the University of Colorado in Boulder, and they were using a different type of bacteria that utilizes photosynthesis and gelatin and sand. And what they found was that if they actually cut one of the bricks that they made in half and then added some new gelatin and sand to it, that it started to grow again, which is pretty incredible. This is really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to what I would call self-healing cities. There's a really big project that I've been tracking for about 5 or 6 years now in Leeds in the UK, where they're designing tiny little fleets of robots, little tiny robots that can repair buildings or streets or anything else before something goes really wrong, at the first sign that maintenance is needed. So by 2050, we might find that we're surrounded in a world of little bots that do self-repairs to our cities and buildings. The technology that you may not be aware of is 3D printing when it comes to actually printing buildings. And this is an example from a company in China, Winsung Engineering, that has a printer, a 3D printer that uses construction refuse, so waste materials. It's 20 feet wide, no, 20 feet tall, 40 feet wide, 120 feet long, and it printed this office building, which is a real building in Dubai, in 17 days. And they shipped it from China to the UAE. It took 2 days to assemble and then another 3 months to actually do all the interior fit out and cabling and everything else that they wanted to do. Pretty cool technology, and they're not the only company doing it. There are others as well. Driverless vehicles are going to have a very, very large impact on the corporate space. So many of you would have buildings that have really big parking garages. And once driverless cars start to become prevalent, these garages will probably be, for the most part, empty, because if you've got a smart car that can drive itself, it may not stay parked in the garage. It's going to go out and maybe do ride sharing and earn some cash for the owner while they're sitting in the office, assuming they are sitting in the office. But it's accelerating the use, what's accelerating is empty building spaces. Because with COVID, we now have a lot of empty buildings. Depending on where you're at in the world, you may be in a lockdown where you're actually not allowed to go into a business at all. That's certainly the case in some cities here in Australia. So one of the interesting things that has been experimented with here in Australia by a company called Mirvac, which manages $10 billion worth of real estate assets, is using these parking garages as literally urban farms. And they've been they did an experiment here in Sydney at one of the Ernst & Young buildings, where they're allowing staff to go down into the basement, the parking garage area, and literally do urban farming in the garage. And they were even selling their excess to local businesses, to like cafes and so on. And people would get together during lunch and mingle with each other, meet people out of their departments, and have a lot of fun. Sustainability is going to be incredibly important because, one of the challenges that we face as humanity is not just COVID, it's climate change. And look, there's so much that I could talk about in this area. And if we have time in Q&A, I'd love for you to ask me about some of the new technologies that are being experimented with in the whole area of sustainability, because it's a lot more than just solar and wind farms. So as we go into the future, what will it be like to be human? Will we take technology into our bodies and maybe start to become cyborgs? Well, the answer is probably yes. And it may start with something like smart contact lenses that literally have the same kinds, you put them in your eyes and have the same functions that you might have on a smartphone, plus augmented reality, plus video cameras that you turn on and off just by blinking, and married with biotech. So believe it or not, from the tear ducts and the tears in your eyes, you can start to sense diseases in your body. There's been a lot of work over the last number of years in developing these smart contacts. But it gets even wackier than that as we start to go into implants inside of our own brains. I don't know about you, but I don't know if I'd be too keen to get a chip inside my brain. But there's been work in research labs for at least a decade now, where initially scientists were looking at things like Alzheimer's or dementia and trying to find ways of helping people who had these horrible diseases be able to store and regain access to memories that they otherwise wouldn't have access to. Other work that's being done has to do with people who've been paralyzed and want to be able to regain functions in their body. Most famously, and I'm sure in California you know a lot about this, is Elon Musk and his Neuralink project. When he initially came up with this, the idea was that he wanted to be able to merge the human brain with AI so that we can sort of fight off the robots. And then it moved to more of a medical emphasis to be able to help people who had severe spinal cord injuries be able to walk again. He did a press conference recently where he showed his Neuralink that had been implanted into pigs' brains, and a pig that actually had it taken out and survived. And with these chips, he's actually been lately talking about emotion control as well as the medical aspects. Now, I don't know if I want a chip to control my emotions, and my gosh, what happens if somebody hacks the chip that is inside of your brain? What are you going to do? Wipe your brain like you'd wipe a computer and put all your memories back? I don't think so. It's kind of fun, kind of wacky, but it's something that's coming in the future, and we will see new job categories of brain-machine interface specialists. And this is just the start of where we're going into the future of humanity, because there's also been a tremendous amount of work with nanobots. So this is just a pretty graphic illustration. It's not a real nanobot, but there are a lot of research laboratories all around the world that are working on nanotechnology. There's one experiment that's really interesting. It was a collaboration between an institute in China and at the University of Arizona, where they designed a little nanobot that is literally DNA that's rolled up in a tube that is able to detect the proteins of particular types of cancer. And when it detects that protein, these little nanobots, are just a few nanometers across, unfurl, and they inject a blood clotting drug into it. And literally, they are doing precision medicine and starving this cancer cell from getting blood supply and making it die off. In the future, we're very likely to see nanobots in our body, initially to help us fight off diseases like cancer and other things, but eventually they may be in our bodies acting as little advanced scouts detecting when something is about to go wrong in our bodies before it goes wrong and fixing it. Can you imagine having nanobots in your body? Well, gosh, what if something goes wrong? Who are you going to call? Well, there's going to be a new job, and it's going to be a nanomedic. And they're going to be people who are able to manipulate these little nanobots that may have spread through your entire body and help you get out of whatever kind of trouble that you may be in. This is just the start of where we're going in terms of medical care and the future of humanity. And before I talk a little bit more about this, I just want to go back to nanobots for 1 second and say that if we actually had these little nanobots prevalent in our bodies today, then COVID would most likely not even be a problem, because COVID and viruses are so tiny that the problem we have with trying to find medications to get at them is that they're inside a cell, and we just don't have the right technology to get to it, whereas a nanobot actually could. But it gets even more interesting when you consider other medical technologies such as stem cells and genetic engineering. We're starting to talk about regenerative medicine here. And when it comes to stem cells, there was an experiment last year by a scientist in Israel who used 3D printing to bioprint a little living miniature human heart, and it was beating. Now, mind you, this is about 10 years away from any kind of commercialization, and they're not the only research lab working on it. There are a lot of them. But bioprinting is really fascinating. Can you imagine if you had a heart that needed to be replaced and you didn't have to wait on a donor list? You just use your own stem cells to literally regrow a brand new version of your heart without defects, and you would not have to worry about biocompatibility. But it gets even crazier than that. There are a lot of experiments out there where scientists are looking at age reversal and even stopping aging. A couple of years ago, the Salk Institute was doing experiments with mice using genetic engineering, and with one living mouse in particular, this mouse had progeria, this rapid aging disease. They were able to reverse the aging in a mouse. So imagine if you can start to reverse the aging in human bodies. And it gets even funnier than that. Imagine if you could actually find the gene that controls aging and switch it off. There are research scientists who believe that within the next 10, maybe 15 years, maybe it'll take 20 years, we'll find that gene that lets us switch off aging. And when we do, our lifespans might be between 400 and 800 years. Can you imagine working for 400 years? Forget about retiring at 50 or 60. You'd never be able to fund yourself that long. How about being married to the same person for 800 years? Think about the impact of a very long-lived society on the residential real estate market. So a lot of residential real estate is made possible through inheritance, but if your parents, grandparents, and great-great-great-great-great-grandparents are all still alive, you're not going to be inheriting money from that. There's got to be some sort of ripple effect on the commercial real estate market. I'm not quite sure how that ties in yet, but it definitely will impact us as a human species. One of the new jobs that I think we're going to see as we start getting more and more genetic engineering happening in our lifetimes is that we will start to see groups of new jobs of the future that involve genetic 3D designers. Already, there are people that are taking implants into their bodies, not for medical purposes, but literally to give them senses that maybe an insect has, but a human doesn't have. Imagine that you decided that you wanted to change your looks and you could actually manipulate your genetic profile and give yourself a different kind of appendage. Or maybe just something as simple as, hey, I don't really like the way my nose looks, I want it to have a different shape. And instead of going for plastic surgery or any kind of surgery, you go to a genetic designer and they design the contours of the face that you want to have. We could end up creating an entirely new branch of the human species. And in fact, we very well may adapt ourselves for life in outer space. We may be able to adapt our bodies to be able to live in different kinds of gravity or even different kinds of atmosphere, literally by changing the genetics of our body. So speaking of space travel, space, the final frontier. Gotta love that line coming out of Star Trek. But you know what? It's a reality. It's not science fiction anymore. It's starting to happen, and it's happening right now in our lifetimes, this very moment. And the reason it's happening and is going to be a huge industry is that private industry has invented reusable rockets. Can you imagine if airplanes were one-time only use? You would pay a fortune for flying in an airplane. Right now, not a lot of them are flying, but eventually we'll get back to some sort of semblance of normal, and they will. But imagine now that you have spaceships where you could literally travel between Earth and the Moon or Earth and the Mars or somewhere else for roughly the cost of a business class airfare of going between Sydney and the United States. And being in California, you're probably very well aware of SpaceX and the things that Elon Musk is doing with his Starship project. He already has 2 working prototypes that have been shown with takeoffs and landings to be reusable. And he's planning to have a manned mission to Mars by the year 2024. That's only 4 years from now. And by 2050, he would like to have a complete self-sustaining colony on Mars with over 1,000 starships. And that's just one company. Imagine as the private industry starts to get into this in a major way, this is going to be an absolutely huge new industry. And it won't just be planets. We'll be doing asteroid mining and all sorts of other things. And guess what? This is going to be the new terrain for corporate real estate as well. And there are so many interesting aspects of this. I don't know if any of you have seen the National Geographic 2-series show called Mars, but it is definitely worth viewing to see what happens as private corporations start to develop colonies on Mars, as well as governments also starting to develop their own colonies and the clashes that they run into. There are going to be all kinds of new regulations that will need to be put into place as we start to move to being an extraplanetary civilization. And you may very well someday have corporate real estate holdings on the Moon, the Mars, or spaceships, or other planets. This certainly is, I think, the future of humanity, to be a multiplanetary species. So I hope you've enjoyed this little ride into the future, and I am very happy to take any questions that you might have, and I'm just going to stop my screen sharing so that you can see me, and I will take questions.
Well, thank you, Shara. It's definitely an interesting future we have in front of us, and I think some of that stuff might have scared people as much as it inspires people. At least I know I feel that way. Definitely don't want to live 800 years, and I'm not so sure about the genetic modification. That kind of feels a little, little like
Yeah, it is. I know it is. It is really weird and wacky. But as a futurist and as a technology futurist, yes, there's a lot of imagination that goes into it, but I always base it on hardcore science and the things that are happening in research labs. So genetic engineering, it's happening in research labs. We've had the Human Genome Project. I don't even remember how many years that's been in progress. It's been a long time. We're now at the stage, especially with the use of artificial intelligence, where we're able to understand what a whole range of the base pairs of our human genome actually do. And there are about 3 million pairs inside our human genome. Once we get that complete understanding, then it is absolutely possible that we'll be able to manipulate it. We have technologies today like CRISPR that allow genetic engineering, not just of human bodies, but of plants and animals and other things. So we're moving into a future that sounds just like science fiction, but it's based on science, fact, and experiments that are happening today.
Absolutely. And talk about that. One of the things we talked about before the session started was around hyperloops. What do you see happening around that and how that will impact real estate?
Well, again, you're all based in California, so I'm just going to assume that the audience is familiar with the concept of a hyperloop. Basically we're talking about super fast transport, like the next generation of fast trains. So one of the things that I think will have an impact on commercial real estate as these start to roll out, and I should say right now, up until late last year, there were a number of commercial companies going really gung-ho and starting to do trials and rollouts. From what I can see, things are at a standstill because of COVID. Just attention has been diverted elsewhere. But sooner or later, we're going to come back to this. They're still in trial stage, so we can't say 100% for sure that technology is really going to pan out. But the early tests were indicating that it probably will. So if you can imagine that you can take a drive that would normally be a 2-hour drive and turn it into a 10-minute commute, what that means from a corporate perspective is that you don't have to locate your corporate headquarters in an expensive downtown area. You could locate your corporate headquarters in a cheaper regional area and have people come into it from either the downtown area or other regional areas surrounding it and have a very, very short commute time. So it will really start to change the dynamics of where people live and where people work and where you make investments in real estate. And of course, if it does pan out, this is another corporate asset that some of your members may be already investing in. And if not now, once the trials prove out, they may decide, well, this is actually a really good corporate investment for a whole range of different reasons because it's an asset.
Absolutely. And we're probably going to see a lot of change. We also were talking about Elevate and these other flying drones and other ways that will be disrupting new patterns.
Absolutely. And, again, I was talking to a bunch of you a few days ago, and from what I understand, Elevate is still on track to happen by 2023. One of the test cities, however, was Melbourne, Australia. And what you may not know is that all these poor people in Melbourne have been literally stuck in lockdown in their home, the entire city, for more than 2 months now. And there's a curfew from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. So you can't even go out of your house for any reason whatsoever. Forget about going to work. You can't even go out, to go for a walk, to walk your dog. If you do that, you could get arrested or fined.
Yeah. It's definitely been a different year. And just a reminder for anyone, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. We've had a few interesting discussion topics here, I would say. I'm not sure this is a futurist question, but what is the least run rate on a spaceship? And we had a couple of guesses here already.
The least, I'm sorry, what was the question?
Yeah, the least run rate on a spaceship.
That I do not know the answer to.
I would say that's probably not something that we.
I don't think that.
Out yet.
Yeah, I haven't seen a serious.
I was gonna say I think it's more of a back and forth kind of, You know, I think we definitely think like some people did react to the car wash for people, so I can agree with that. I thought that was quite interesting too, which is the door.
Yeah, and it's movable too. At least that particular one, so you can move it from one entrance to another.
Exactly.
In fact, I saw another video on the TV newscast, and the way that they had people go through it reminded me of how we have to go through TSA if you're not already, if you don't have the clearance, where you put your hands up and you turn around, space yourself out, and you might have to do the same thing that you do in airports as you go into a commercial building. Oh my gosh, our life is complicated enough already. Add that to the mix.
Exactly, right. And all these technologies are hopefully going to go down. We're looking at them now and they seem very, very strange to us and probably very expensive. But the question is, how long it's going to take before things become normality, right? Just like the self-driving cars that are becoming part of Teslas and everything here today.
Yeah, well, I was looking at a number of these disinfectant doors, and I saw some on Alibaba, one of the Chinese websites, and I think it was in U.S. currency, and I think the cheapest one I saw was about $2,600. So it's not an astronomical cost, and some of them ranged up to, I think it was about 15,000 US from memory, just depending on what kind of functions and makes and models you were using. But that's not an expense that would be out of consideration for a corporate building or a commercial shopping center. You wouldn't pay that for your house, but unless you're wealthy maybe, but it's not priced out of the market. Some of the disinfectant robots, however, are much, much, much more expensive. There you're talking probably, $80,000 to $100,000.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully you don't need it for your house.
Yeah, well, at least that's today. But you know what happens with, it's like anything else. Once you start to get to mass manufacturing, then the prices always start to come down. So right now these are all, brand new inventions, and the price is always high when you're making things in small quantity as opposed to mass marketing.
Absolutely. And we got a good question here, right, about sustainability, or a couple of them actually. So you touched on it. You said there's a lot more to talk about. So what else have you got to share about what is the future bringing us around sustainability, and what can we be doing?
Well, one of the things that we want to look at is absolutely recycling and doing whatever we can as individuals to help the planet. But more interestingly, there's some new technologies being experimented with. I won't have time to go into all of them, but let me name one of them. It's called blue energy. And blue energy uses the kinetic energy of saltwater oceans where rivers of fresh water run into the saltwater, and they're using little nanomembranes to capture the energy and store it in hydroelectric plants, and then be able to use this to put out across the grid. And if you think about blue energy, oh, by the way, and the wastewater is just like brackish salt water, so it doesn't harm the environment at all. I mean, you get that in nature anyway. And if you think about the globe, there is every continent where you've got water surrounding the continent, and you've got rivers that run into the oceans. And it's 24/7. It's not impacted by climate, I guess, unless you've got an ice age and the water's frozen. But barring that, you've got a 24/7 reliable, renewable energy that has zero environmental impact.
It sounds like we need more of that in the world at this point, for sure.
Oh, yeah.
One of the
we need to keep our planet healthy because it's going to keep us healthy.
It's definitely been something we've been talking about a lot in California lately, especially around global warming and changing our behaviors here. One of the other questions coming out here is about companies and people to watch. So one is, who's the next Elon Musk person that we should be looking at, or what are the companies we should be looking at?
Oh, that's one that I really couldn't tell you because, while I'm a futurist, I'm not actually a psychic. So I don't know who the next Elon Musk might be, but he or she is probably a science fiction geek and is already playing around with things and playing around with ideas and coming up with innovations that we haven't even thought of yet. I would also be looking into research labs and some of the really cool stuff that's happening there, because what typically would happen to commercialize research that's being done by academics is that you'd have someone, maybe a PhD student that was part of a project, and they decide that they're going to branch out into a startup. And those kinds of people are likely to be the next Elon Musks that will be the entrepreneurs with vision and the experience of building stuff and have this great idea and want to make it commercial. And from the corporate perspective, what you want to look for are these really neat people that have really cool ideas and help back them with investment capital.
Absolutely. So I got a longer one here. I'll start at the end, actually, which is somebody curious. They sense a hint of Philadelphia or Delaware accent in your speech.
Oh, absolutely. Oh my gosh, I can't believe you picked up the Philly accent. I was born in Philly. I'm a dual citizen. My family's still in Philly, so I sometimes, when I'm talking to Americans, I tend to have my American accent comes out a bit more. When I'm talking to my Australian friends, my Aussie accent comes out more. But when I'm talking to a U.S. audience, I try to use U.S. terminology, and I guess the Philly accent still comes through. But it's really funny. A lot of times when I'm in the U.S., people, don't think I'm from America, and I've had some really funny experiences with that. But yes, definitely.
So great guess.
Great guess. Spot on.
The other question part of this was around successful vaccines and how that will affect the current trajectories. Do you think that the pendulum will swing back with agility, and will we adapt to the pandemic now that we know how to do it? So is this going to change any of what we're talking about?
Gosh, this is such a huge topic, and it can be really, really controversial. So if I think about vaccines, just put aside COVID for a moment. If you think about any kind of new drug or any kind of new vaccine, the typical testing time would be 10 to 15 years, and you'd be doing a lot of tests on people with all kinds of different medical conditions, and you wouldn't release it to billions of people at the same time until you actually looked at the long-term efficacy and whether there are unknown side effects. And you also need to take into account something called polypharmacy, and that is what happens when people are taking 2 or more drugs. What are the unintended side effects that you have no idea might happen if you're just testing a single drug on a healthy person? What happens if that person is taking 3 medications, or they have an impaired immune system, or they're elderly and their bodies just are not able to cope with even the tiny little bit of the virus that goes into the vaccine? And it gets even more complicated with COVID because of the long gestation period before symptoms arise, and people who scientists are saying have been asymptomatic and they just never show the symptoms, but they're able to spread it to others, like typhoid Mary. There are theories, and I'll just say theories, that this may not be a natural virus, that it may actually be genetically modified. I'm not going to comment one way or the other. I'm just going to say that that's out there as a potential theory. Another thing that could happen, just in the course of nature, and it happens every year with the common flu, is that the virus mutates. So even if you take a vaccine today, that vaccine may not be effective against the mutated version of the virus that is 2021 or 2022. And I'm also hearing from all kinds of medical researchers, because I listen to this kind of stuff almost every day, that there may actually even already be different strains of COVID in different parts of the world, which is one of the reasons why quarantines and lockdowns and all these other things that we've been trying to do haven't been as effective as we thought that they would be, is because there are different strains, and as soon as you take people from another part of the world into an area that might be already have developed immunities, they don't have immunity to this new strain. So there's a lot of complexity. However, once we get to the stage where we have nanotechnology and we can actually get inside the cells of a body, which we can't do with today's drugs, really, not very well, then I think we're going to have a real cure. We'll be able to stop it in its tracks, but it may be with us for a long time. There are researchers that I've talked to from World Health Organization that think it's probably 2023 until we start to see some sort of stabilization. But there are others who say, this could go on through 2025, 2030, And, we just don't know when the end is really going to be in sight to this. So, we're on a roller coaster, unfortunately.
And as scary as it might sound, that with the nanotechnologies, it does sound like that could be something that could keep us from having to go through this once again in 100 to 150 years, right?
Well, the nanotechnology that's being experimented on could be available, from the perspective of finding illnesses in our body and stopping them, like that blood clotting example that I gave, like really, really targeted precision medicine for a specific disease. That could be available in a 10-year time frame. It might take a little bit more, so that's not the far future, but it could very well happen.
It's exciting news. And this wraps up our program for today. So thank you so much, Shara, for joining us. I know it's an early morning for you, so thank you for making this work. And thank you, everyone, for joining today. Hopefully, you're able to stay for the networking session.